Hi, and welcome to the first session of Noise and Social Synthesis, Reappraising Attali and the Political Economy of Music. Um, the concept of noise has been the subject of a number of recent approaches. One may count amongst them Cecile Malaspina's An Epistemology of Noise, Mattin's Social Dissonance, Inigo Wilkins's forthcoming Irreversible Noise, among many others. Common to these recent approaches is criticality towards the concept of noise as indexing a form of indeterminacy or as embodying the negative, an approach that was exemplified within a previous generation of noise theorists by Jacques Attali's Noise, the Political Economy of Music. In a manner much of its own, the book offers a model of music as the sacrificial ritual of noise, modulating different forms the relationship of music to noise takes in the successive societal stages of representation, repetition, and finally composition. Far from being categories pertaining only to aesthetic theory, these are modes of organization of economy, foreshadowing, according to Attali, by the distinct connections music entertains to noise. While agreeing with the more contemporary assessment of Attali's ineffabilism in his use of the concept of noise, in this seminar we intend to critically reappraise Attali's book under the light of two recent developments that are, in the face of it, unrelated to the concept of noise. The first would be Kojin Karatani's reconstruction of the phases of political economy as different modes of intercourse, as presented in his volume Structure of World History. The second would be the publication by the collective subset of theoretical practice of its Atlas of Experimental Politics, where Karatani's categories are used in a different context, where they are seen as ways to operate, in Alfred Sohn-Rethel's parlance, social syntheses that beget different societal forms within a multi-layered perspective on the constitution of social worlds. The initial hypothesis of the seminar stems from the possible coincidences between Attali's periodization of the history of political economy, replicating his different aesthetic models of noise, and Karatani's modes of intercourse, sacrifice gift economy, or mode A, representation plunder and redistribution, or mode B, repetition capitalism, or mode C. The parallel breaks, though, in the perspective categories of Attali's composition and of Karatani's mode D, which corresponds to his idea of communism, to which a third hypothesis is adjoined in the figure of the STP's communist hypothesis, that offers us an invaluable opportunity to discuss the prospective futures these frameworks are able to make thinkable. Your instructor is JP Caron. He's a philosopher and artist based in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. His doctoral research, developed at both the University of Paris and the University of Sao Paulo, proposed a critique of the aesthetic philosophy of John Cage in the context of contemporary ontology of art and philosophy of language. He is a lecturer in philosophy at the UFRJ, and he militates in the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology, the CSII, an international political collective dedicated to examining the viability of the communist hypothesis today. He's been practicing noise and experimental music for more than 15 years, and several of his records have been released, many through his own imprint, Seminal Records. Recently, he's been working on the problem of generic organization as it appears in different fields like art, science, and politics, and its relationship to scale sensitivity. Take it away, JP.
Thank you. Thank you for this the reading of the introduction. And also, I should mention again that my bio is kind of outdated. I think this is on me. I have to update it because the CSII is no more since 2021, but we are the STP now, which is one of the subjects of the seminar, a subset of theoretical practice, which comes from the SET, that was the Circle of Studies of the Idea and Ideology. Uh, so this should be updated at some point. Sorry about that. Uh, yeah. Well, the blurb was quite kind of already quite. There's quite a lot there, I think, to unpack, and the purpose of today's session is almost to unpack that, to give a kind of a general view of what's at stake in this seminar. It would be quite neat to have like one session per mode of intercourse or Attali's categories, because there are four Attali categories 4 Karatani categories and 3+1 weird thing by the STP, but we will have only 4 sessions, so I have to kind of make do with that and redistribute the content accordingly. So let me maybe just start sharing. Yeah, it's here. Wow, this is a miracle. Okay, are you seeing that? Yes? Can anybody answer like, yeah, thank you. So, so I prepared quite a lot of information for today because we need to cover a lot. We have like 3 books, basically, like 2 books and 1 book-length article. We won't be covering all of it, of course. Maybe the Attali will cover all of it, at least nominally, because, of course, there are stuff in there that maybe won't be the object of explicit consideration. Karatani, I think we could cover almost all of it, but I think you all got a document that makes explicit what are the possible objects of presentations. So if we do a good division of labor between the classes and the presentations, we might be able to cover all of Karatani's book, perhaps, and the relevant parts of the STP article, Atlas of Experimental Politics. So we have then 3 kind of book-length things to cover, which is a lot. So this is why also I didn't include a lot of subsidiary or lateral readings. But I'm thinking there might be a little bit yet, but we'll see. One of the advantages I see with this seminar is we have like 2 weeks between sessions, which is also enables us to read more stuff between sessions and also prepare presentations. So this might enrich the experience. This is a good experiment to have. I never did a seminar at the New Center with that kind of shape. So this might help things out. Also, there's one little extra thing I'm supposed, because I discussed with Rafael that this, not because I'm obliged to, but I'm supposed to give, sorry, playlist of a sound playlist, because I want to illustrate some of Attali's developments, this aesthetics part of this seminar, which will be kind of more hardly focused on political economy, but the aesthetic part, I should make 4 different playlists that I'm working on. I was supposed to present you this today, but I'll do it the next few days. You'll get it at the Google Classroom and things like that. And these also might be object of presentations for the more artistically inclined of the students. Okay, so okay, so the description of the seminar was already given, so I'll skip that one. For those who know me, I've been obsessed with Zonhettel's concept of social synthesis, and this seminar, in this seminar, we won't be talking at length about Zonhettel, but it is kind of implicitly in the title because it is part of a series that I'm kind of envisaging, which is called Noise and Social Synthesis. This is part 2 of the series. It's not supposed to be like part 1 of a big seminar. I want to make this clear already, because if I get to do part 2 of Noise and Social Synthesis, it will be kind of a independent seminar. But they are also all part of this kind of umbrella of the relationship between social synthesis and noise. And social synthesis comes from Zonhettel's book, Intellectual and Manual Labor, which was also the object of a previous seminar here at the New Center. So I'm just giving just for you to have this overall, this definition going through all the material. What Zonhettel says about social synthesis. He says, as social forms develop and change, so also there's the synthesis, which holds together the multiplicity of links operating between men according to the division of labor. Every society made up of a plurality of individuals is a network coming into effect through their actions. How they act is of primary importance for the social network. What they think is of secondary importance. Their activities must interrelate in order to fit into a society and must contain at least a minimum of uniformity if the society is to function as a whole. This coherence can be conscious or unconscious, but exist it must. Otherwise, society would cease to be viable and individuals would come to grief as a result of their multiple dependencies upon one another. Expressed in very general terms, this is a precondition for the survival of every kind of society. It formulates what I term social synthesis. This notion is thus nothing other than a constituent part of the Marxian concept of social formation, a part which in the course of my long preoccupation with historical forms of thinking has become indispensable to my understanding of man's social condition. From this observation, I derive the general epistemological proposition that the socially necessary forms of thinking of an epoch are those in conformity with the socially synthetic functions of that epoch. Okay, this might seem unrelated, but it is actually very crucial to what we'll be discussing, because as the blurb that was read in the beginning also makes clear, it has to do with a certain, not just the, I mean, Attali's framework deals not only with the relationship between internal to music or music making, the relationship between noise, what is supposedly noise or what is considered as noise, as being noise, and what is considered as being music, and the kind of transits between these two categories, but also with the economic basis that, in a certain sense, have a certain relationship with these aesthetic contents. So, and this is a very kind of difficult kind of proposition to make sense of and to turn, in a certain sense, plausible. But it's the way it is expressed already gives credence to the idea that it has something to do with the social synthetic functions of a certain practice, or if we don't want to locate in music making, make it all an all-powerful kind of specific practice, we just would say something to the extent that maybe the aesthetic content of music has something to do with the way it is, the milieu of music making and consumption is socially synthesized. So the transit between a certain kind of content or internal content to a certain practice and the way this practice constructs the milieu within which this content is exists in a certain sense, is what I'm deeming also part of what is a socially synthetic function of a certain practice. Okay, I think this will be clear as we go on. Okay, but this is something that we must have in the horizon. Okay. What I want to do today is to just first, I'll just give you some spoilers, just kind of motivate this. I have to motivate this. This is kind of the comparison that was announced as the introduction said. Attali has a periodization of the relationship between music and noise, which has to do also with the way the social milieu of music and consumption of music is synthesized. So it has this four different phases: sacrifice, representation, repetition, composition. This is basically the framework that he's presenting in the book, Noise, the Political Economy of Music. And my wager is that this kind of replicates almost exactly, up to a point, Karatani's classification of 4 different modes of intercourse. Okay, I want to get to this because this is kind of the object of the seminar as a whole. But in order to get to this, I just have kind of to motivate it sufficiently. Okay, so before introducing the modes and categories, I have this kind of methodological problem put forward by Marx in the contribution to the critique of political economy. So, which is the difference between what is the infrastructural elements and the superstructural elements. So, In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production, appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. So this is Marx 101, the idea that you have like material forces of production, which are the how to say, I would call it determination in the last instance by the economic, and you have all these different structures that arise from these material forces of production, which come to be called the political, legal, ideological, cultural superstructure. Okay, so the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of consciousness. So superstructure, general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. So this is the idea which was parsed in traditional Orthodox Marxism as basically the superstructure being completely determined by the infrastructure, which is something that we have to discuss if we are to make sense of what Attali is doing, even if Attali is not necessarily a Marxist, like he discusses Marxism. But Caron is a Marxist, and he also has like this interesting relationship to Attali that I want to explore. That is the construction of this interplay between something that comes from the superstructural element, music in Attali, or in Caron, the legal, political elements, and the economical proper, right? So this relativization of this specific relationship between the infrastructural and the superstructural is an important element in justifying these frameworks that will be the subject of this seminar. Okay. So the changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophical, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Okay, and this was quoted by Caron in the introduction, which I take it that you all got in the Google Classroom. Okay. And this also weaves directly into what the foreword that Jameson writes to Attali's book, right? So and Jameson himself is a Marxist, and he's saying, to use a well-worn Marxian formula, economics is generally considered to be a science of the base or infrastructure, whereas music traditionally counts among the most rarefied, abstract, and specialized of all superstructural activities. To propose intelligible links between these two levels or types of cultural or intellectual phenomena would therefore seem to demand the production of a host of intermediary connections or mediations that are by no means obvious or evident. So this is a problem for both these from the Marxian point of view, for both of these endeavors. Okay. And Jameson goes on, the originality of Jacques Attali's book then becomes clear. He is the first to have drawn the other possible logical consequence of the reciprocal interaction model, namely the possibility of a superstructure to anticipate historical developments, to foreshadow new social formations in a prophetic and annunciatory way. This is kind of the most polemical thesis of Attali's book, which is not, I'm not really espousing it. I'm just, of course, this is absolutely necessary in order to reappraise it and criticize it and understand it, which is the idea that music has a prophetic kind of capacity to anticipate through the structural internal structural relationships between what is deemed the structured musical elements and noise, the shapes of organizations to come, which is, I would say, kind of unjustified in the book. It's more like a kind of a first axiom, or lightly justified, as we will see. I won't espouse this thesis, but the interesting thing is to kind of untether the different models of the relationship between music and noise and their material basis from these maybe these more unjustified kind of anticipatory dimension, which is of course up to discussion here. So yeah, the argument of noise is that music, unique among the arts for reasons that are themselves overdetermined, has precisely this enunciatory vocation, and that the music of today stands both as a promise of a new liberating mode of production and as the menace of a dystopian possibility, which is that mode of production's baleful mirror image. There are social and historical reasons for the orientation toward the future in Attali's thought, as well as for the bleak bias toward the retrospective in thinkers like Adorno, whose social and historical pessimism is documented in negative dialectics. Not only is there Attali's greater sympathy for contemporary music, including the whole area of popular and mass cultural production, which Adorno notoriously stigmatized as easy music and jazz in the kind of used as a kind of derogatory word, degraded and schematic commodities mass-produced by the culture industry. Okay. So here, I think I just selected this quote because for me, it's an important dimension that we will go back to by the end of this session and also by the end of the seminar, which is a certain relation to temporality, which is the idea of a thinking that is oriented toward the future or a retrospective thinking of emancipation, which is kind of has been, in my experience and the discussions that we've been having with different political tendencies and movements, an important kind of division, whether future-oriented thinking is even possible, or whether the thinking of emancipation that is faithful to the idea that Marx put forward in the Communist Manifesto of communism as the real movement, not as a state of affairs to be projected onto the future, right? And the retrospective thinking as more faithful to that kind of insight of communism as the real movement. So this actually puts a lot of problems and for us to discuss that we'll find in the comparison between the fourth different categories, the fourth category proposed by Attali, the fourth category proposed by Caratani, and what the STP is calling communist hypothesis. There's a kind of an important interface of discussion there, which has to do with the futurity of this thinking, of future-orientedness of this thinking, or even if this future-orientedness is possible, desirable, or something like that. Okay, so just to pause a little bit. Any questions until now? I guess I'm going pretty quick. So if anybody wants to make a comment or a question, it will be welcome. It can be a question about methodology or things like that, if you want. Nope. Nobody? Okay. So I'll go on. So, and then beyond Jameson's presentation of Attali's framework, there's this, I selected these quotes by Attali, which kind of puts for the basic ideas of the book, just for us to have also in mind. Music, an immaterial pleasure turned commodity, now heralds a society of the sign, of the immaterial up for sale, of the social relation unified in money. It heralds, for it is prophetic. It has always been, in its essence, a herald of times to come. Thus, as we shall see, if it is true that the political organization of the 20th century is rooted in the political thought of the 19th, the latter is almost entirely present in embryonic form in the music of the 18th century. So it seems that his hypothesis of anticipation, musical anticipation of political forms to come or economic forms to come, and then political forms to come, because this is what the paragraph is saying, comes from this arch that he gets from 18th century music, basically the formation of tonality, full-fledged tonality, and what he calls the paradigm of representation, right, which is his second paradigm, the paradigm of representation in music that gets caught in political thinking as representation, democratic representation, these kind of things. And it comes from there, from this kind of location of this transit between one certain form that appears first in aesthetics or in music, and then gets transmitted to these other fields, which is kind of an observation, but I'm not sure the induction that he makes from that is warrants the idea that music is always a herald. But anyway, we will be talking about this anyway. In the chapters that follow, music will be presented as originating in ritual murder, of which it is a simulacrum, a minor form of sacrifice heralding change. We will see that in that capacity, it was an attribute of religious and political power, that it signified order, but also that it prefigured subversion. Then, after entering into commodity exchange, after, of course, historically much later, it participated in the growth and creation of capital and the spectacle. Fetishized as a commodity, music is illustrative of the evolution of our entire society. De-ritualize a social form, repress an activity of the body, specialize its practice, sell it as a spectacle, generalize its consumption, and then see to it that it is stockpiled until it loses its meaning, which is kind of the third moment of Attali's narrative, which is repetition. So it starts, as I mentioned already, from sacrifice, the idea that there is something, there is intelligibility and ordering to be gained by sacrificing the noisy element, which is a simulacrum of ritual sacrifice in the way that, for instance, Marcel Mauss proposes, or actually Girard is the basis for. We will be talking about Girard next session, but is the basis of Attali's understanding of ritual murder, by which a certain community gain a certain expels the menace, the natural menace to the community in a certain sense. So the idea is that the relationship of music to noise analogizes this kind of expelling of the menace coming from outside of community in a certain sense, and community as something that is predicated upon a certain social order and the reproduction of this social order. Okay, so this is the basic idea, and it also sheds some light onto Attali's concept of noise, which will be also the object of much criticism and recently more so. Okay, so and then after the commodity, music is illustrative of the evolution, and then it is within this very quick paragraph. He's also prefiguring some of the forms that is trajectory of the relationship between music, noise, and the economy will take within the book, like fetish as a commodity with the advent of the commodity form of capitalism. Music is illustrative of the evolution of our entire society to de-ritualize the social form, repress an activity of the body. Here he's referring to the professionalization of the activity of the musician, which comes with the idea of selling tickets and in a certain sense, an enclosure of the performing space, whereby you have to pay an entrance for then you have the right to experience a certain form of music making that is professionalized, therefore is a certain domestication of the body. It entails a certain domestication of the body, and this comes within a little bit earlier than his paradigm of representation with the idea of court music. We'll be talking a little bit about that as well in more detail. Specialize its praxis, sell it as a spectacle, just what I said. Generalize its consumption. This also is a further paradigm, a further phase, which is what he calls a repetition, which corresponds to the advent of recording technologies that democratize the access to these performances in a certain sense. Then see to it that it's stockpiled until it loses its meaning. So there's this idea of that is quite interesting in Attali. We'll be also discussing this at some length, the difference between use time and exchange time. Like you have to, the idea of kind of the collector of the experience of music within the paradigm of repetition, which has to do with the time spent gaining the money that will be spent acquiring the use time of the records that you are acquiring. So the idea is within repetition, there's too much use time being produced, which means there's too much music being produced and being almost industrially manufactured. So you don't get to have like enough use time to experience that. So you have this stockpiled time as the result of these variable relationships between exchange time and use time. Okay, we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. It's kind of interesting part of his book. It is neither an autonomous activity nor an automatic indicator of the economic infrastructure. It is a herald for change is inscribed in noise faster than it transforms society. So here is like the kind of justification for the idea that aesthetic forms that deal with noise in a certain sense may anticipate the different organizational forms that would compose society at some point. So the idea is just that the recoding or the reorganization of sensible materials because of the medium, the very medium, music or art in a certain sense, is faster. Like you are refashioning it, reorganizing it. This is more easily and more swiftly reorganized than, of course, the political economical life. So in a certain sense, but this also, I think, leaves Attali open to a certain criticism in the sense of a certain gerrymandering, right? Like if we are able to produce a plethora of different aesthetic forms, right? And with much quicker way than we are able to produce political organizational forms or economical organizational forms. It is always possible that we are selecting after the fact the ones that, in a certain sense, indicate the next political organizational form to come, right? So it's not, we are not able to basically assign causality between the composition of these aesthetic forms and the social composition of organizational forms necessarily. But there is kind of this idea of a certain mirroring, which is, in my sense, the way I can, this is me, we can also discuss this problem. The way we can make this plausible and useful for me is in a certain quasi-simultaneous sense, and to vindicate the idea, the Marxian idea of the economical basis influence on the consciousness of man in a certain sense. So because there are quasi kind of simultaneous formations, right? Of course, we have to go through a myriad of mediations to make sense, more specific sense of that. Certain aesthetic forms may be thinkable, may become thinkable, right? We don't need full-fledged social formations, determined social formations to have the corresponding aesthetic form, but you may have the process of becoming of these social formations may inscribe a certain possibility into the horizon of the possible for aesthetical forms in a certain sense as well. So, and vice versa, right? So you might have like this kind of dialectical relationship whereby at some point, material organization is first, at some other point, aesthetic organization gets there first. So I think this is more to it in the way I think about these issues. Many of you, I think, were in the real abstraction seminar, and it dealt exactly with that in a certain sense. I mentioned Zonhattel and his concept of social synthesis. Why is this important to us in a certain sense? Is because, for instance, Zonhattel had this materialist critique of epistemology in the sense that he wanted to find in the material basis the way by which something like the transcendental subject or the categories of mathematized science or the abstract categories of Greek philosophy gets transmitted to the mind, right? So very briefly, like we were exploring like his master thought that this all comes from the exchange abstraction, like because at first we are enmeshed in a world of kind of differentiated elements. Everything is what it is. And exchange abstraction creates this equivalence between different things. Once you exchange one commodity to another, for another, a certain exchange value emerges that has nothing to do with the empirical properties of said commodities. And he's locating there the emergence of something of abstraction, what he calls real abstraction, because it's not thought abstraction. It's not something that we are thinking before we are doing. It's something that we are doing. And because we are doing, this abstract layer emerges so that it becomes thinkable, something like a substance in the early Greek sense, for instance, because everything is different. Where in the world do you have access to something that is the same beyond its accidents, for instance, which is a classical concept of substance, right? So the idea of this homogeneous form, abstract form, would be transmitted to the mind by the fact that you start acting as if different stuff is equivalent, and by different stuff, I mean with different empirical properties, they become equivalent in commodity exchange. So this was Zonhattel's master thought, and in that seminar, we did kind of a critique of that thought, because it seems to, even if it is interesting and maybe even true, it is kind of jumped ahead of a lot of mediations that are necessary to make sense of that thinking in a certain sense, right? So it's not as if we use money and therefore Greek philosophy, right? There's a whole process going on there, and retrieve these mediations is kind of maybe my megalomaniac project, and which has to do with this seminar and the last one, right? And this is why these to parse out these relationships between material basis and superstructure is so important here, and it's so important as well to give a certain use to Attali's book beyond the I'd say the polemical or the I don't know exaggerated kind of statements about music being a herald of times to come and things like that. Okay, so this is just to start my criticism and to get a feel for the kind of discussion that we might be having in the seminar. Okay, so any questions? I just talked a lot, I think, or any comments?
I have a quick question about so there might be an analogy, I'm sorry, between like real abstraction and sort of noise, in that it registers a kind of meta level that's associated with the social, but not directly, and like an emanation of it or something. And but I was like, real abstraction comes with its own mode of inscription in the form of exchange, where it feels like Attali emphasizes the fact that music is immaterial, and part of its sort of alignment with theoretical practices comes from this immateriality. So I was wondering, like, in relation to the question of substance, how would you situate like noise and music in terms of its like substantiality?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Never thought of that. Yeah. Thank you, Ali. For Attali, this immateriality is actually what's responsible for kind of the different rhythm, right? That music is able to impinge upon the changes and the integration of noise and of its outside, right? So it's like there is already a kind of abstract an already abstract practice that, because it is abstract, it already is able to reorganize much more quickly the relationship between that which is unwanted and that which is part of a certain organization, social organization, right? Regarding the relationship between that and real abstraction, what is interesting in a certain sense is that it's almost as if music becomes real abstraction in Attali's framework, in a certain sense. Like it's a kind of a social practice, and it has something to do. It's quite common. There's a lot of analogies with what Attali is saying about commodity exchange, because one thing that I didn't mention that is very important for Attali's framework is the idea that it's how we act that makes it so, and not what we think, right? So for a commodity exchange to be installed, the exchangers must be interested in the use values of the commodities being exchanged. So you are interested in the use value of commodity A while exchanging commodity B for it. You're not interested in the equivalence, but the equivalence comes from the interest, the active interest, from the acts that actually are constrained by the active interest of the mind into the use value and not the exchange value, right? And with music, in a certain sense, I think it is similar. If I'm going to respond to your very difficult and interesting question, because it kind of needs a certain speculative response, because I'm not sure, I don't think Attali has it sorted out. But this relationship, I would say that music is abstract also in a kind of secondary sense, right? If we try to understand why is it that the most abstract and most advanced and most noisy expressions of music in 20th century are so unpopular in a certain sense. It has to do with the fact that even if music is the most abstract, it is almost felt as if it is the most concrete, because it has to do with a certain kind of second nature through which we come to it, and we think it expresses such and such emotions. So the activity of music has to do with a certain kind of I would even use the expression of French philosopher Roger Puivel, la maîtrise des émotions, kind of the mastering of the emotions in a certain sense, which is a kind of interesting turn of phrase. So music has this kind of dual structure where it's very abstract, but in a sense we kind of repress the abstraction of music because we are interested in its effects. And the interest in these effects, in a certain sense, makes it so that a certain form of selection has to be made within music making. I'm kind of improvising an answer here, okay, Ali? But trying to make sense of a kind of invariance, maybe a historical invariance that would perhaps make sense of music in its sacrificial stage, in its representative stage, in its repetitious stage as well, which has to do with that, with the fact that it's a kind of an abstraction in the second sense, whereby a certain selection is operated in order to maintain a certain interest into an effect. So it's not as if musicians are I don't know, the theoreticians of the future organization to come, but they are so after the fact and are so in the secondary degree in a certain sense. So this is a kind of interesting relationship that is possible to draw between, I think, Zonhettel's and Attali's frameworks. But I would say the principal one that is kind of overarching here, which is why I brought Zonhettel in the beginning, is this concept of social synthesis and the relationship between what are the material conditions of certain practices, the relationship between these material conditions and the practices that they condition, right? And the kind of bootstrapping that you get from the practice out of the conditions themselves, in a certain sense. So things become thinkable because there are certain practices that are conditioned by certain material conditions, and by being thinkable, you may be able to gain the resources to think yourself out of these material conditions themselves, right? So it is kind of this interplay between what is internal to a certain discipline and what is external as a condition of that discipline, and the relationship between one and the other, which are kind of also an invariant that is present in Attali, and both in Attali and Zonhettel in different models, different ways. Okay, did I answer?
Yes, completely. Thank you.
Okay. Marcel has a question. You're muted, sorry.
Hey, yeah. So my question, I think you already touched on it a bit, and it goes into a similar direction as Ellie's. But there is I think it's on page 9, right at the beginning of the sub-chapter Mirror, where in the second paragraph he writes, is mirror because as a mode of immaterial production, it relates to the structuring of theoretical paradigms far ahead of concrete production.
Yeah.
And I mean, you already talked about it just now, but a question that I had is how I felt that he doesn't really account for the material conditions that make musical production sort of possible. And I'm wondering how, to some extent, the split between music as a material and then the infrastructure as material is a bit artificial, because especially in, like, let's say, also in experiments in the 60s and 70s, where performance and music or performance and noise comes together.
Yep.
And the embodied act of music becomes something very crucial. Yeah, I'm just wondering how close they are, also with respect to what Jameson's he quotes Engels saying something about the what was it, the reciprocal interaction, the mutual dependence of the base and the superstructure. And I'm wondering if Attali is not jumping over a problem or kind of skipping something crucial there, but maybe also which is part of his time. And I'm really interested in sort of also because you're calling it reappraisal of Attali, now talking about the book 50 years after it was written, and looking at the pace of the technology with which music has been produced, even just in the last decade, but also since the 70s, and the kind of like interaction between the performance of music and the materiality with which it's being produced, especially now with digital media, etc. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, but that's
fantastic. Thank you, Marcel. No, I'm not sure he's jumping over a problem. I do think in the way he thinks through these problems, he's always taking into account the material dimension. But of course, the phrase you just selected seem to uphold a kind of hard division between the material and the immaterial, right? I wouldn't understand it that way. Like there is music is wholly immaterial. I would say that one way out of this conundrum is to say that music is partially immaterial. There's an immaterial element to music making, as there is an immaterial element to art in general, whereby you have like a certain material medium that you have to work on in order to arrive at a certain image or a certain idea or a certain I don't know, a certain structure, right? So I would say that this is a split that is within music itself, in a certain sense, like the split between the immaterial and the material. I was emphasizing the dimension of second nature, because if you are going to what he deems the sacrificial mode or the sacrificial paradigm, I think the most then we have to make some kind of bold speculation. But he deems that the usual mode of music making there is the modal one. Like you have like the modes, which are based on I don't know, natural resonances and things like that. So you have like this very close connection to what is sounding, right? So what is sounding from the instruments, and what is a certain form of music making that is closer to immediate practice in a certain sense. And within representation, you gain with a paradigm of we are actually doing spoilers here, but anyway, with representation you gain levels of abstraction in a sense, because with representation you have notation, you have this kind of specialization, the idea that you are repeating a specific musical corpus and stuff like that, right? Improvisation is less important, composition becomes more and more important. So I think there's an interplay there, because also notation is also a material medium and a technology. So the problem is, in order to make explicit all the mediations that goes into the process, you wouldn't be able to get very far, because it's too much. So I think in Attali's writing, he elides, you are right, he elides a lot of these mediations in order to just make a point. But I think they are there somewhat, right? We just, there is an effort to be made in the sense of making them explicit, right? So I don't think it is pitting immaterial against materiality as such. I think it's kind of immaterial, the immaterial element of music that gains a certain traction over what the material element is doing in a certain sense. And this kind of weaves into what I was saying about this kind of anticipatory function, which this is something that I think it's kind of a schematic in Attali. It's not really like anything that comes from music anticipates what's coming in political, economic organization, but it's much more like a zigzag form, like something that you have a certain political, economic organization that makes possible certain moves within the space of not only the social space, but in your inferential space, in the space of your thinking, in a certain sense. And by making available these movements in your inferential space, you are then able to make something artistically that wasn't possible. And by observing these results, these results might enable or might even demand a certain change in a little part of the social fabric. And sometimes these changes become bigger changes, right? So there you have like this model of mutual kind of interaction between one thing and the other, which I would favor over the idea that it is like music anticipating social organization, which is something that I would criticize in the way Attali presents it. Did I answer? Yep. You're muted.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, but it's something to be discussed.
Yeah, sure.
In the seminar, right? So
yeah.
It's something that we'll probably go back onto many times. Lane.
Hi. I think you've touched it already a little bit with this quasi-simultaneous formation of superstructure and infrastructure. It's a while ago that I've read Attali, but as I remember it, most of it is actually describing the economic part of music and not so much the musical form itself. Where I think it makes sense to somehow describe the modes of artistic production as anticipation of coming production in other economic parts, while at the same time, I think it might be make total sense to add more of the analysis that we have in Frankfurt School of musical form, that is having this retrospective mode of analyzing the abstract modes of exchange value, for example, in how music itself is formalized. For example, with in terms of timing, things like this.
Oh yeah, I think you touched upon an interesting thing by saying like Attali is more concerned by the economic form that music making takes than the intrinsic structuration of music, right? I think you are right, but at the same time, it's early to make that call, because at some point he, for instance, makes the relationship between representation and the tonal system, for instance, or between sacrifice and the modal one, and between repetition. Repetition is a weirder one, because the repetition is predicated upon the technical invention of how to say that, reproducibility, technical reproducibility, right? Be it in the form of the, I don't know, notated score, but also and principally in the form of the actual storage of sound by recording media. And there are many results in musical language that come from these economical bases. But I think the difficult part, which is what is ironic, is that he doesn't want to say that musical forms are influenced by the economical basis. or by technical inventions. And technical inventions, of course, enter into economical relations and all of that, and influence economical relations. For instance, the cultural industry wouldn't be possible without the recording technical means, according to him and many others. But this is not what he's saying. He's saying that music heralds a certain kind of social relation, right? So it's kind of difficult to parse his most polemical thesis out in a plausible sense, in a more plausible sense, because much of the time what he's actually doing in the book, the way I read it, is to relate a certain form of structuration, and the structuration is unclear. The limit between what is part of the musical language and what is part of the musical practice in the kind of more material sense. For instance, you get, for instance, sophisticated musical forms like sonata form, exactly at the moment that there is a professionalization of a musician and the ability and the training to repeat certain structures and a certain specificity to the specificity of treatment of the musical notation. Of course, there was musical notation before, but for instance, in the Baroque, there is still a lot of improvisation going on. And in the classical romantic period, you have much more kind of, you are much more prone to repeat a certain musical work. There is this fantastic philosopher of music that I like a lot, Lydia Girl, who's kind of dating the concept of a musical work around the beginning of the 19th century. Because of that, there's a set of different practices that come together and reinforce the idea that there is this thing that should be repeated and respected. And with it comes a certain demand for a bunch of different practices, right? So to parse out the idea that the demands of a certain musical language would prefigure social organization at large is a difficult one. Maybe if we weaken a little bit the thesis and says something like the appearance of a certain social relation that has to do with music making, which means a slightly different thing. If we weaken the polemical thesis and instead of saying music heralds the future, something like that, we would say music as a certain practice is a localized practice that has a certain capacity to prefigure dissemination into a bigger practice. This is easier because you have a kind of homogeneity between different kinds of practice. But what is interesting as well is the fact that you don't have a clear limit between what is the practical material element and the conceptual, let's say, abstract element of musical language. As I was exemplifying, something like sonata form comes also with the idea of a certain confidence on the notation to fixate a certain result, and also practices that enforce copyright, right? And because you have copyright enforced and you have a certain market that is formed for not for composers, it's for works, which is fundamentally different from the way composers worked up until that point. They were at the service of a certain aristocrat or something like that. So they get paid to produce a certain number of works monthly or yearly or whatever, right? So you have like a certain period of time, you have a kind of almost a salary, right? But you get to the time of Beethoven, you get this idea of the freelance composer. He's being commissioned, he's producing individual works, and to have an individual work, you must have a bunch of a kind of a cluster of conditions and a cluster of practices that stabilize the individual work. And much of what we take to be the sophistication, the specific kind of sophistication of, for instance, musical language in the 19th century, where you get like huge orchestra playing a Mahler symphony may come from these considerations, the formation of a certain market for individual works and the freelance composer, for instance. So you have like this transit between material basis and the superstructure, what is being done musically, but the converse is more difficult. So I would parse out the idea that music heralds the future if we are to accept a version of that, in the sense of musical practice might be able to prefigure something of the social practice at large, which is even still in that version, still polemical and still difficult to accept. But anyway, this is basically the subject of the segment. Did I answer? Okay. Mattin?
Can you listen? Can you hear me right now? Is my microphone working? Okay. Earlier you called this notion of Attali stating that music is prophetical, as you called it an axiom. And I was also viewing it as an axiom, but then I noticed in the first chapter, one justification he gives is that music would be faster than other practices at exploring the possibilities of a given code. And he had already identified music with a kind of codification of noise. So it stays kind of ambiguous if that code he mentions is, at least for me, if it is like musical form or if it is social form or social phenomenon. But still, it seems like this efficiency, this speed of exploration, of aesthetical exploration, is what can, in a way, prefigure future changes in social forms.
Yeah.
At least is what it seemed to me, but it stays ambiguous. It's not like definite. It's a single line in the text. And then he goes back to discussing the interplay between infrastructure and superstructure.
Yeah, I agree. The thing, this is why I was kind of mentioning a certain kind of gerrymandering that is possible there, because if the justification is that immaterial practice, or practice that has an immaterial element, is faster than social organization, this is the justification for the prefiguring that music is making of social form. It's kind of difficult to vindicate the connection between a certain specific organizational form and the immediate futural societal form, right? So this connection is difficult to vindicate. It's much easier to think in the sense of, okay, we have like this medium where we can experiment a lot of different things. And by experimenting a lot of different things, we get to different, a plethora of different forms. Some of these forms might have an interesting analogy to real material organizations, right? Some of these, no, they might have like a more distant relationship to these material organizations. So it's kind of difficult to assume a relationship between the prefiguring thesis and real social organization without a certain concept of a certain necessary evolution of, necessary evolution of musical form and therefore of societal form, which is difficult to vindicate, right? So it seems that the work being done, the work that will filter out the number of possibilities that we might come with artistically or musically and future societal forms, the work would be a certain form of teleology. But I know Attali does not want teleology. So there's a problem there. I don't think this problem gets solved at all, right? And it's not my job here to solve this problem, but it is my job to criticize, as their question is also criticizing. And the reason I think it's also ambiguous is because it's not really clear what the limit is. As I was responding to Lane, it's not really clear what the limit is between what is a demand out of the social practice of music and what is the result of this demand in the sense of musical language. Strictly material Marxist way of saying it is to say like sonata form comes about because you have like the technical means to produce it, and the technical means to produce comes about because you have a certain societal change that makes the demand for individual works something that is central. But Attali is not saying that. This is kind of the problem, right? And it's unclear really what the limit is between what is the external demand and the internal, internal to musical language, the internal result of this demand, right? But anyway, I'm just commenting upon your question because I agree with what you're saying. I'm not really, I would say I'm not really responding or completing a critique, right? Okay. So after this round of questions, I must go on a little bit. So then there is this criticism of Attali that comes from Inigo Wilkins. I think it's important to remember that I think it was Marcel or somebody or Line was saying that this is a reappraisal. Of course, it is a reappraisal because as the introduction was saying, Attali is somewhat outdated in the specific milieu that is thinking noise and things like that, because his idea of pitching music as something determinate, as a determinate form, or something that has a determinate unfolding against something that is a kind of indeterminate, or a kind of has a material status, whereby this means that it is not conceptually organized, which is noise, right? It seems to appeal to a certain concept of noise as indeterminacy, or as the author of music as a determinate thing is, right? And this is something that is, in a certain sense, it is dated. This is something that comes from the 70s that is being challenged recently by somebody like Wilkins or Cecile Malaspina's book, Epistemology of Noise. We won't be dealing too much with that issue, because what I want to do is to profit from Attali's comparisons between music and the economical modes, to think of the economical modes themselves and the communist hypothesis by the end of the seminar, instead of really being a seminar about noise. It's not really the subject, but I think it's important to mention that there's this criticism going on, which I quote then Inigo Wilkins' Reversible Noise. It's the 2016 version, which was his doctoral thesis. It's not the book is being written, but anyway. Firstly, Jacques Attali, Noise, A Political Economy of Music, which describes the political economy of music in terms of historical epochs whose transition thresholds are prophetically announced by new musical forms, which appear as noise to mainstream tastes. This links the scientific and economic conception of the information noise nexus to the domain of aesthetics. However, not merely are there numerous problems both with Attali's conception of noise and with his analysis of its political economy, but really the whole conceptual framework that he departs from must be rejected as stemming from an illegitimate overextension of the concept of noise, bound up with a fetishization of self-organizing systems and an exaltation of chance. Of course, this is a very hard critique, right? So this is what actually, the fact that Attali is coming from such fire, coming under such fire, is what kind of prompted me to reappraise the book, not by not by shedding its flaws, but by seeing in it what is interesting to a certain contemporary reading of a social form that I chose Karatani and the STP as more recent elements, but one interesting thing that is might be a subject of a future investigation is the relationship between these different modes that come from Attali and Caratani, and for instance, what Deleuze and Guattari are saying in the Anti-Oedipus as well, about the different phases of, coding and over-coding and all of that vocabulary, okay? So here I say I'm positioning myself here while agreeing with the first sentence. The intent of this presentation or this seminar is Attali's rhetoric notwithstanding to verify if it's possible to defend some of his propositions by introducing a few redefinition of scope into his concepts, which is what we are already discussing right now in the response to the questions, right? So here I have to also introduce Caratani. So also the problem here, as we've been discussing, is this relationship between infrastructure and superstructure, right? And Caratani has his own version of this problem and his own version of the response to this problem. So he says here in the Structure of World History, this book is an attempt to rethink the history of social formations from the perspective of modes of exchange. Until now in Marxism, this has been taken up from the perspective of modes of production. From that is the perspective of who owns the means of production. Modes of production have been regarded as the economic base, while the political, religious, and cultural, of course, music, for Attali kind of participates in all of that in some register. In the political as a kind of metaphor, but in the religious, very practically, very kind of concretely, and of course in the cultural which is an obvious kind of relationship, have been considered the ideological superstructure. Marxists believe that ideological superstructures such as the state or nation would naturally wither away when the capitalist economy was abolished, but reality betrayed their expectation, and they were tripped up in their attempts to deal with the state and nation. And this is why kind of Caratani is trying to explain this state of affairs by upholding this kind of triple kind of logic, the logic of the complex formed by capital, nation, state, okay? So it's not enough to defeat one logic because there are still the two different logics are still operative, right? We'll be discussing that along the seminar. As a result, Marxists began to stress the relative autonomy of the ideological superstructure. In concrete terms, this meant supplementing the theory of economic determinism with knowledge derived from such fields as psychoanalysis, sociology, and political science. This, however, resulted in a tendency to underestimate the importance of the economic base. And this is, I stress this sentence because Caratani wants to stay clear from this tendency, the tendency to allocate, overemphasize superstructure and to jettison the idea of economic base. And this is not what Caratani is proposing. So he says, for these reasons, we should abandon the belief that mode of production equals economic base, just mode of production. This does not in any way mean, however, that we should abandon the concept of economic base in general. We simply need to launch our investigation from the mode of exchange rather than from the mode of production. If exchange is an economic concept, then all modes of exchange must be economic in nature. In short, if we take the term economic in a broad sense, then nothing prevents us from saying that the social formation is determined by its economic base. So you can preserve that essential statement of Marxism that social formation is determined by its economic base, but Caratani proposes to amplify what counts as the economic base. It's not just the mode of production, but the different modes of exchange that produce these different social formations, capital, nation, and the state for Caratani. For example, the state and nation originate in their own distinct modes of exchange, economic bases. It would be foolish to distinguish these from the economic base and regard them as ideological superstructure, right? The inability to dissolve state and nation through enlightenment is due to their being rooted in specific modes of exchange. They also, it is true, take on idealistic forms, but we can say the same thing about the capitalist economy with its base in in commodity exchange. So here, the triplex system, capital, nation, state, as that he was kind of implicitly already gesturing at. So here's his quote about this: today's advanced capitalist nations are characterized by a triplex system, the capital nation state trinity. In its structure, there is first of all a capitalist market economy. If left to its own devices, however, this will inevitably result in economic disparities and class conflict. To counter this, the nation, which is characterized by an intention towards communality and equality, seeks to resolve the various contradictions brought about by the capitalist economy. The state then fulfills this task through such measures as taxation and redistribution or regulations. Capital, nation, and state all differ from one another, with each being grounded in its own distinct set of principles. But here they are joined together in a mutually supplementary manner. They are linked in the manner of a Borromean knot, in which the whole system will fail if one of the three is missing, okay? So, this is just to motivate Karatani's distinction between different spheres of the economic base. So it's not as if he's actually considering that which was traditionally considered to be superstructural as part of the economical base. And as a certain sense, what is interesting in Karatani, also from the point of view of social synthesis, is this pluralization of social synthesis, right? And this is something that also weaves into my previous discussion here in this session about social synthesis. Like if you have like social synthesis operated through exchange abstraction in Zonhettel, in Karatani you have different kinds of social synthesis operated through different kinds of logic. That are the logic that he, from the point of view of contemporary world, right, he connects with the idea of capital, the idea of nation, and the concept of the state. But historically, he will kind of historicize these distinctions as mode A, mode B, and mode C. We'll get to that. So yeah, and then let's get back to Attali's framework to see how these paradigms connect to Karatani's paradigms, and we get to this comparison here. So in this book, I would like to trace the political economy of music as a succession of orders. In other words, differences done violence by noises. In other words, the calling into question of differences that are prophectic because they create new orders, unstable and changing. Briefly, we will see that it is possible to distinguish on our map 3 zones, 3 stages, 3 strategic usages of music by power, which is interesting because at some point he says it is music itself or it's a musical practice, but it's also the usage of music by power. So the problem with Attali is that this is all kind of mixed together. So it's kind of difficult to get to a more precise kind of relationship. And of course, he may get away with a lot of hand-wavy kind of formulations because of that. But anyway, it is interesting to see that he's kind of the succession of his categories are kind of are analogous to the succession of Karatani's categories. So today we want to build to construct the framework, and the framework that is the interface between these two, and further between these two and the subset of theoretical practice 1. Okay, so in one of these zones, it seems that music is used and produced in the ritual in an attempt to make people forget the general violence. So forgetting, first function. In another, it is employed to make people believe in the harmony of the world, that there is order in exchange and legitimacy in commercial power, which is representation. And finally, there is one in which it serves to silence by mass producing a deafening, syncretic kind of music and censoring all other human noises, which is repetition for him. Make people forget, make them believe, silence them. In all three cases, music is a tool of power, of ritual power, when it is a question of making people forget the fear of violence, of representative power, when it is a question of making them believe in order and harmony, and of bureaucratic power, when it is a question of silencing those who oppose it. I disagree with bureaucratic power as being what is characteristic of mode C or of exchange abstraction and repetition. But anyway, he calls it bureaucratic power. We will discuss this issue in session 3 of the seminar. But anyway, I disagree with that. Thus, music localizes and specifies power because it marks and regiments the rare noises that cultures in their normalization of behavior see fit to authorize. Music accounts for them, it makes them audible. Okay? Quite interesting paragraph anyway. Sorry. So, two ideas suggested by Attali's paragraph. The first one is this relationship between both frameworks. I'll be, if we have time, fleshing out a little bit more these different categories. Otherwise, we'll leave it to next session, but I think we have time. So, two ideas suggested by the paragraph is this kind of this pairing of sacrifice and mode A, which is pooling and reciprocity, representation and mode D, which is plunder and redistribution, repetition and mode C, which is commodity exchange, and composition mode D. Actually, representation and repetition kind of divide something that comes from mode B and from mode C. We'll be discussing that. But anyway, this is the first idea, right? And there is a periodization there of what Attali is calling sacrifice, representation, repetition, and composition, and a certain historical line that is common to both Attali and Caron. Settled communities as prone to mode A. These 300 years are the age of representation, which is competitive capitalism and repetition. The 1919s, the 20th century, basically until 1977, which is the date of Attali's writing of the book, and composition, which is the futuristic speculation. The fourth category is an interesting one because it is the speculative one for each system that we are kind of visiting here. And the second idea is this idea that I was already discussing, the critique of Attali's concept of noise. So what is Attali's concept of noise? Returning to Inigo Wilkins' critique, he says there is an immediately political dimension to the existing literature on the concept of noise, where it is associated with the uncontrolled element or uncontrollable force that leads to revolutionary transformation. Noise is frequently alluded to as the irrepressible chaos of a multitude or of desire against the forces of oppression and repression. This is exemplified by Lucretian concept of the clinament found in Serre and Deleuze, the micropolitics of desire in Deleuze and Guattari, and its development in the radical post-Marxist tradition of Italian autonomism. So there's this criticism of this use of noise. We'll keep this in mind, but I think we can redefine the scope of Attali's concept of noise in order to escape this indictment. We'll be doing that in the second session. This music localizes and specifies power because it marks and regiments the rare noises that cultures in their normalization of behavior seek to authorize. This is a quote that we had in the other slide. Instead of seeing noise as a site of resistance against control, we could try and think of it in terms of the inexistent that comes to produce a new order once it is transcendentally indexed to a world. This I'm using Badiouian kind of turn of language. We should talk more thoroughly about this once we get to the next session of this seminar when dealing directly with sacrifice and representation. Okay, just kind of promissory note. So going back to how Caratani defines the modes of exchange. So Caratani defined his 4 modes as follows. Mode A is defined by the logic of pooling and reciprocity. Its main social form. Actually, I think I'll change the order. So Caratanian modes first, and then I read the STP, okay? So what Caratani says about the modes. So about A. In the sense, reciprocity, which is gift and counter-gift between communities, right? It's first mode. Gift economy. In this sense, reciprocity has to be distinguished from the pooling that occurs within a household. For instance, in a hunting and gathering band formed by several households, captured spoils are pooled and equally redistributed. This pooling or redistribution derives from a principle that exists only within the interior of a household or within a band formed by several households. This is because classical political economy would think that exchange, gift and counter-gift comes from the relationship between two individuals, whereas what Caron is proposing is not that the gift economy that we'll be discussing in the next session more thoroughly, that it doesn't come from the relationship between two individuals, because individuals usually were organized within this hunting and gathering band before a settlement, right? And you had like a pooling of resources and which were redistributed. So the relationship between the resources and the individuals is one of redistribution. You have like a direct relationship between the mode of production, the productive mode, and the community, what Zon Hettel calls a society of production, instead of a society of appropriation, where you have to exchange something you have to exchange something for other thing, because it's not everybody who has access to everything, right? So once you get to have like different private spheres, you will need to exchange stuff. So what Caron is saying is that the first mode of this exchange, still not exchange abstraction, not capitalist, but economy of gift and counter-gift, occurs between communities and not between individuals which are members of these communities, because within the community you have the pooling and redistribution going on. So it is when one community has a relationship with another community of like different tribes, and they have to exchange goods, so that you have like this reciprocity, this relationship of reciprocity, which composes what he calls mode A. So this pooling and redistribution derives from a principle that exists only within the interior of a household or within a band formed by several households. In contrast, therefore, reciprocity arises when one household or band establishes lasting amicable relations with another household or band. In other words, it is through reciprocity that a higher order collective, right, that transcends the individual household takes form. Accordingly, reciprocity is not so much a principle of community as it is a principle for forming larger, stratified communities. So there's a different organizational principles going on within the community and between communities, and mode A comes in between communities and form what he calls mini systems. Mode of exchange B also arises between communities. It begins when one community plunders another. Plunder in itself is not a kind of exchange. How then does plunder gets transformed into a mode of exchange? If a community wants to engage in continuous plunder, the dominant community cannot simply carry out acts of plunder, but must also give something to its targets. It must protect the dominated community from other aggressors, as well as foster it through public works, such as irrigation systems. Right? Herein lies the prototype for the state. Max Weber, argued that the essence of the state was its monopoly on violence. This does not simply mean that the state is founded on violence. The state protects its constituent peoples by prohibiting non-state actors from engaging in violence. So you have like kind of Hobbesian kind of picture here, or classical, or maybe not as precise, but anyway, what we inherit as a kind of Hobbesian picture of the state as being able to buy the monopoly of force to avoid the war of everyone with everyone else, right? So mode of exchange B has to do with that, with the fact that there's plunder, there's a certain relationship of domination, but you just don't get to dominate and exhaust what you dominate. You want to keep control of what you conquered, so to speak. So therefore, you have like this mode of exchange, which is plunder and then redistribution, right? So you have to give something back to the one who is dominated. So this is the root of the state, according to Caratani. Next, we have mode of exchange C, or commodity exchange, which is grounded in mutual consent. This arises when exchange is neither constrained by the obligation inherent in gift giving, as in mode of exchange A, nor imposed through violence, as in the pillaging or mode of exchange B. In sum, commodity exchange is established only when the participants mutually recognize each other as free beings. Accordingly, when commodity exchange develops, it tends to free individuals from the primary communal constraints that arise from the principle of gift exchange. The city takes form through this sort of free association between individuals. The problem for Caratani is that this freedom that comes from commodity exchange does not entail equality, right? So you have, again, a form of domination that comes from the domination, the accumulation, capital accumulation in relationships of exchange that presuppose a certain form of freedom, free agents as engaging in this exchange. Okay. So what STP says about this? So STP says, Caratani defines his four modes as follows. Mode A is defined by the logic of pooling and reciprocity. So we have like this very schematically here in this slide, okay? Its main social form is that of the gift and the contra-gift. Its normative structure is that of customs and rules, valid primarily within communities. Its main form of hierarchy is that of honor. You understand right from that, like the shape of traditional society taking shape through these different criteria that mode A brings with it, okay? Its basic collective structure is the household, further expanded into settlements composed of households and federations composed of settlements. When it is a dominant mode, it is able to scale up and integrate social groups to form mini systems, which is the name of the first part of Caratani's book that we'll be reading. Yeah, already next time. Mode B is defined by the logic of plunder and redistribution. Its main social form is that of domination and protection between communities. Its normative structure is that of the laws imposed by dominant communities over the subservient ones. Its main hierarchical structure is that of the state. Its collective structure is that of cities, further divided into centers, margins, submargins, and communities which are out of sphere, outside the reach of its power. When it is the dominant mode, it is able to scale up and integrate communities into world empires. Mode C is defined by the logic of commodity exchange. Its basic social form is that of value and money commodities. It works not by social rules or laws, but by tendencies, which constrain the flow and reproduction of commodities. Its hierarchical structure is that of social classes, and its basic collective form is that of the market. When it is the dominant mode, we call this social formation a capitalist one, and its total extent across centers, semi-peripheries, and peripheries note the absence of an outside forming a world economy. Okay, so these are ABC according to the STP. And finally, we have the problem of mode D. So Caratani has four modes, as I was saying, and the STP rejects Caratani's fourth mode in favor of a different kind of concept for emancipation, because the fourth one in Caratani, in the STP, and in Attali are the emancipatory modes, are the futural kind of hypothesis that accounts for emancipation of previous forms of domination and limitation, okay? So in addition to this, I must also describe mode of exchange D. This is a Caron saying. This represents not only the rejection of the state that was generated through mode of exchange B, but also a transcending of the class divisions produced in mode of exchange C. We might think of mode of exchange D as representing the return of mode of exchange A in a higher dimension. It is a mode of exchange that is simultaneously free and mutual. Unlike the other three modes, mode of exchange D does not exist in actuality. It is the imaginary return of the moment of reciprocity that has been repressed under modes of exchange B and C. Accordingly, it originally appeared in the form of religious movements. We will be reading Caron's chapter on religion, because religion is a place where he thinks mode D is thinkable at first. So you have like this secularization of kind of religious hypothesis of emancipation in political movements that are kind of communist movements or anarchist movements, that are interested in the emancipation from current limitations. Okay. So Caron's fourth mode, here is STP, the second paragraph. Caron's fourth mode, mode D, should be treated separately from the other three for two reasons. First of all, because it serves a more prescriptive function in its theoretical apparatus. Caron uses the idea of a mode of intercourse based on free association and the mutuality of freedom to reconstruct a silent history of socialist impetus that would bring together nomadic lifestyles, the sense of justice of world religions, secular philosophical ethics, and modern socialism. Furthermore, by defending the transcendental status of this fourth mode, he is able to propose a coherent description of a possible socialist world where mode D would be dominant over all others, making it consistent with his general theory of modes and their articulation. As interesting as this construction might be, the value of this approach to communist politics is limited, since analytically, this additional mode plays no determinate part in defining different social formations in his theory, to the point that mode D is not even included in his theory of the articulation of modes A, B, and C in capitalism. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff here. Okay, I think we have time for that. STP will reject mode D. We will be talking about what STP wants here. STP is communist hypothesis, so wait out a little bit. And we will revisit the four modes in Attali now. So when power wants to make people forget, music is ritual sacrifice, right? The scapegoat. When it wants them to believe, music is enactment, representation. When it wants to silence them, it is reproduced, normalized, repetition. Thus, it heralds a subversion of both the existing code and the power in the making, well before the latter is in place. So you can understand broadly the relationship between sacrifice as something that is a form of exchange with nature, right? We will be talking about that with Attali, with both Attali and Caron next time. Sacrifice as a form of exchange, of a gift, in a gift kind of economy, right? So you have mode A as characteristic of ritual sacrifice here in Attali. Something like mode A is at place. When it wants them to believe, music is enactment, representation. Of course, the violent element of domination of mode B is not present in Attali here directly, but the idea of representation, it is something that we very easily might associate with the idea of the state of mode B, of the idea that you have like a sovereign power that represents the others in a certain sense, because it has the monopoly of violence, right? So representation broadly maps onto mode B, right? When it wants to silence them, it is reproduced, normalized, repetition. Repetition is what? Repetition is basically generalized equivalence. So repetition, Attali's mode of repetition, maps broadly to Caron's mode C. This is what I wanted to justify today, right? Commodity exchange. Of course, there are kind of subtle differences because, or subtle misalignments that are said, because of course, to have representation, you already have capitalism. But then the question becomes, what is the dominant mode in each of Attali's mode, and what is the dominant mode in the concrete social formations that Karatani is analyzing, right? And what are the relationship of these concrete social formations and their dominant modes with what is reproduced or what is produced in the localized musical practice in order to vindicate or not Attali's statement of music as kind of a primary place to verify that, which is a weaker version, or music as her herald of political and economic organizations to come. Okay, so here I think I managed to kind of express a big part of the hypothesis of the seminar. So I'm going on a little bit. Today, in embryonic form, beyond repetition lies freedom. And there he's starting to, here in this passage, starting to account for his fourth mode. More than a new music, a fourth kind of musical practice. It heralds the arrival of new social relations. Music is becoming composition. Of course, composition is a kind of a word that has a long history, but for Attali, composition is a specific thing, right? It's a specific thing that is a fourth mode or fourth paradigm for him. So representation against fear, repetition against harmony, composition against normality. It is this interplay of concepts that music invites us to enter in its capacity as the herald of organizations and the overall political strategies. Okay. Maybe for network. Yeah, no, I'm not. I think we have time. Thus, under the sacrificial code, music was heard not only as a place of sacrifice, but also at all of the places of daily life and labor, where it was present in its ambiguous role as an integrator and subverter. After the economy broke this network down, there came to be new modes of musical distribution, other places for music to be expressed, heard, and exchanged, other networks. These networks changed music. So this is the relationship, like it gets caught within different networks, but these networks change music in return. But once again, the essential point is that they heralded a very thoroughgoing change in social organization, a change in the overall mode of economic production. We can distinguish conceptually four essential types of networks and four possible forms of musical distribution corresponding to the four fundamental structures it is possible to schematize. Each of these networks relate to a technology and a different level of social structuring. They succeeded and also interpenetrated one another in the economy of music. So the first three, because I want then to talk about the fourth one at some length before we end today. First network is that of the sacrificial ritual already described. It is a distributive network for all of the orders, myths, and religious, social, or economic relations of symbolic societies. It is centralized on the level of ideology, and decentralized on the economic level. We'll be talking about that later. A new network of music emerges with representation. Music becomes a spectacle attended at specific places, concert halls, the closed space of the simulacrum of ritual, a confinement made necessary by the collection of entrance fees. As you see, you have like this limit, this limitation that is imposed by the fact that you have to pay entrance in order to see a representation. So you have like this, also this same form that we get from mode B in Karatani, that is this prone to the state logic. In this network, the value of music is its use value as spectacle. This new value simulates and replaces the sacrificial value of music in the preceding network. Performers and actors are producers of a special kind who are paid in money by spectators. we will see that this network characterizes the entire economy of competitive capitalism, the primitive mode of capitalism. So this is a kind of interesting result in a certain sense, and it's a kind of a criticism that we get from people to Karatani. How can you make sense of the advent of the state without already a certain primitive form of capital, right? While in Attali, this is already countenanced in a certain sense, because within representation, you have like the kind of the same form of either or limits that is a characteristic of the state logic, while at the same time, this is enforced by the economy of competitive capitalism, because you have to have the limitation whereby you are able to acquire the right to get into that or out of that or get access to that product, right? The third network, that of repetition, appears at the end of the 19th century with the advent of recording. This technology, conceived as a way of storing representation, created in 50 years' time with a phonograph record, a new organizational network for the economy of music. In this network, each spectator has a solitary relation with a material object. The consumption of music is individualized, a simulacrum of ritual sacrifice, a blind spectacle. The network is no longer a form of sociality, an opportunity for spectators to meet and communicate, but rather a tool making the individualized stockpiling of music possible on a huge scale. Here again, the new network first appears in music as the herald of a new stage in the organization of capitalism, that of repetitive mass production of all social relations. This remains to be seen when we talk about this specific mode or specific network. Okay, I don't think we need this. This is with repetition. So just skip it so we have time for a little bit of discussion. Beyond the three modes, the fourth mode, composition. Finally, we can envision one last network beyond exchange, in which music could be lived as composition. In other words, in which it would be performed for the musician's own enjoyment as self-communication with no other goal than his own pleasure, as something fundamentally outside all communication, as self-transcendent, as solitary, egotistical, non-commercial act. In this network, what is heard by others would be a byproduct of what the composer or interpreter wrote or performed for the sake of hearing it, just as a book is never more than a byproduct of what the writer wrote for the sake of writing it. At the extreme, music would no longer be made to be heard, but to be seen in order to prevent the composition from being limited by the interpretation, like Beethoven dreaming with every possible interpretation, reading the music he wrote, but could no longer hear. This composition proposes a radical social model, one in which the body is treated as capable not only of production and consumption, and even of entering into relations with others, but also of autonomous pleasure. This network differs from all those preceding it. This capacity for personal transcendence is excluded from other musical networks. In a society of ritualized sacrifice, representational speech, or hierarchical and repetitive communication, egotistical pleasure is repressed and music has value only when it is synonymous with sociality, performance for an audience, or finally the stockpiling of beauty for solvent consumers. But when these modes of communication collapse, all that is left for the musician is self-communication. Here again, this network is ahead of its time and precedes the general evolution of social organization as a whole. So it's very different. Like Attali's composition might have something of the idea of communism that is present in mode D and in the communist hypothesis of the STP, as we will see shortly, but is much more individualized kind of social formation. And this, my hypothesis, the problem that I want to discuss, and I think it will be clear in the next slides, is the amount of the kind of possible space of superimposition between what is understood as freedom in the negative sense, in the sense that you get to do whatever you want, and freedom in the positive sense, which is the object of the communist hypothesis. Like when Marx says that in the communist society you get to do gardening and literary criticism and mathematics and whatever you want at different times of the day, in a certain sense, he points to this generic character, like in the young Marx, this was called the Gattungswesen, like the generic being of man, right? Non-specialized, but which has something to do, or which has some element in common with this kind of Attalian understanding of composition. But it also lends itself, this concept of composition, to a kind of libertarian kind of utopia as well. So there is a kind of, again, a certain ambiguity of what kind of utopia or what kind of futurity is the category of composition pointing towards, right? And I'd say that Attali is the most different of the three. Like there is this element of freedom present in all three, but whereas in Karatani and STP, there's always the element of sociality that makes it possible to have this freedom, whereas Attali is kind of upholding, at least at face value in his text, a certain form of individual anarchy in a certain sense, or individualist anarchy in a certain sense. What is kind of weird is that his example for composition in the book was the kind of prefigurative politics of the networks of free jazz production, for instance, which is far from kind of individualist kind of endeavor, right? But anyway, this is also something to be discussed. We have a huge discussion about this in the fourth session of the seminar, which is the object will be the communist hypothesis, either communist hypothesis, mode D, or composition, okay? So beyond the three modes, the fourth mode, here's myself, I'm posing the question, is composition to be understood as closer to Karatani's mode D or to the STP's communist hypothesis? So again, blah, 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 I read that already. This was part of the other, slide, or the criticism of mode D. So we don't need that. So anyway, just to rehearse, to remind you, Karatani's fourth mode, mode D, should be treated separately from the other three for two reasons. It serves a prescriptive function, right? And it also is not part of the description of the other three modes, whereas the three modes enter in definite relationships in Karatani's mode, where mode D is thought of something that does not exist yet, right? So for us, the STP, there's this communist hypothesis that is the replacement of Karatani's idea, which is this idea of organization. In accordance with our previous critique of Karatani's mode D and our alternative theory that emancipatory politics is composed of heterogeneous social experiments, let us now add a separate point of view to the diagram. I can show the diagram shortly, which we call org. The arrows from org to itself define the space of all possible political organization, a sort of space of free association, and maps from org to the rest of our diagram, define different political struggles, different interactions between political experiments and social constraints coming from the multi-layered transcendental or social formations. Let me see if I can show that maybe here. Yeah, this is our diagram from the atlas. Are you seeing that? I changed the window. Are you seeing the diagram or not? Yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is, I won't be explaining this today, but the idea is that you have like different transcendentals. So you have transcendental mode C, transcendental, which is a pure mode B, right? A transcendental, which is a pure mode A, and you have mixtures. T, transcendental C plus B, A plus B, A plus C, right? And in the center you have K, which is all the existing kind of the domination of a capital mode. K is the capital mode, which is dominating the whole combinations in our present form of society, right? So org is this kind of external element which is refers to the different modes through the specific ways of resisting them in a certain sense. This will be discussed at more detail in the fourth session, okay? But this is the idea. And the organization, then what is important to keep in mind is that we are not then mobilizing a fourth mode. We are mobilizing the space, the total space of organization as where the communist hypothesis is happening. It's not like a fourth thing, is the total thing, is the communist hypothesis, right? I'll discuss this right away. Just a second. So this is just to get a taste of it, right? So unlike Karatani's here, unlike a sort of space of free association, the maps from org to the Estefan diagram define different political struggles, different interactions between political experiments, and social constraints coming from the multi-layered transcendental of social formations. Unlike Karatani's mode D, I'm here. Sorry, here. Unlike Karatani's mode D, the internal consistency and form of org is not transcendentally guaranteed, though there are many political struggles with the most diverse structures and organizational forms. Nothing guarantees beforehand that we are able to adopt a standpoint that allows us to compose them together. This wager is what we call the communist hypothesis, and the construction of a consistent space binding together these political experiments can be seen as a concrete world-building problem. The issue of how to turn localized intervention into our social formation into the general and consistent social constraints on a new world, otherwise known as the socialist transition problem. So how do you get to kind of integrate these political experiments that are dealing with the really existent modes, right, into something that is superseding the capitalist space of organization, right? In other words, here from a previous text from the STP, Contribution to the Critique of Political Organization, against what remains the main theoretical strategy of the left, that is, proposing better descriptions of our current social reality in such a way that our theory is capable of locating and expressing the inconsistencies and weaknesses of our social system in ways that conservative depictions cannot. We want our theoretical space to be infinitely richer than our social world, so that capitalist social formations might appear within it as particular solutions within the broader space of other possible solutions to general problems of social coordination, allocation of resources, and free association. The strategy of regionalizing or situating the parameters of our social formation has profound effects both to theoretical construction as well as to the practice of politics, since the first sign of a broader theoretical framework is its capacity to reformulate problems, in its own terms, meaning that within this framework, communism becomes a theory of how to solve communist problems and not capitalist ones. So you have this idea that is basically, in a nutshell, the STP's communist hypothesis means that the total space of organizations is bigger than the space of capitalist ones, which is a conjecture to be experimentally tested. But we have at least certain frameworks for reading off political experiments the way they are engaging with the different existing modes, A, B, and C. Whereas Karatani defines D then as a kind of prospective image or a regulative ideal, the STP is trying to produce a kind of communist hypothesis that is faithful to the idea that communism is the real movement. It's not a conjecture of a regulative ideal to be satisfied in the future, okay? So here, this question, just to almost finishing, question of temporality then. Here is Karatani again. Sorry. According to Hegel, the essence of something only becomes apparent in its effects, that is, he viewed things ex post facto, after the fact. Kant, on the other hand, viewed things ex ante facto, before the fact. With regard to the future, we can only make predictions, not draw positive conclusions. For this reason, Kant held that ideas are illusions, but they are transcendental illusions. This means that unlike illusions that arise from our sense perception, we cannot eliminate them by way of reason because they are illusions that are necessary to reason itself. In plain language, without these illusions, we would lapse into schizophrenia. Ernst Bloch called Marx's philosophy the philosophy of the future. It attempts to see the not yet conscious. It is forward dreaming. This is correct, yet we must also note that Marx consistently refused to make any conclusive statements about the future. For example, in the German ideology, Marx writes, communism is for us not a state of affairs, which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from the now existing premise. Okay? Here, Marx refuses to define the end or ending of history. In this, he is not only negating Hegel, but also rejecting Kant. So you don't have like the conjecture of a specific state of affairs, right? You have like the means to navigate the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. So this is kind of the replacement of mode D by the STP towards this ecology of political experiments, right? So, and there's a bunch of different problems that are still open, of course, with that hypothesis. I don't think we need this. Yeah, here I was just going to open up to the next session. Attali's antediluvian form, which is sacrifice. We will start next session from sacrifice, but I don't think we need to read this now. We can leave it to next session where we will be discussing sacrifice and representation. Okay. So, any questions, comments before we finish up? We have like 15 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. I think Raviv had a question before.
I was just gonna ask, I think earlier I was thinking about like recording and the historical importance of that and the the reification of music as a commodity, and also how it led to an increased separation of what people call music and what people call musicians.
Okay.
And but I didn't put my hand up because I thought maybe that was kind of implied already by a lot of things you were saying. So, I don't know.
Yeah, I think this is an important point because if you see the trajectory of the different Attali's model, composition comes after repetition, and it's not for other reason. I think it's because you have already in repetition a certain atomization of first the access to what you're listening is atomized, right? Because at least in Attali's account, it's not about a concert anymore, or it's not about a social situation anymore. It's about the individual fruition through records or things like that. And but this is also a separation not between consumers, but between consumer and producer in a certain sense, because it is mediated by a technical object, which is the recording or the phonogram, right? And this brings about this kind of atomized situation where what Attali, I think, takes from that is that this atomized situation will prefigure something of what he calls composition, in the sense that composition is not production for others anymore. It's production for oneself. So it's weird. It's a really weird kind of idea, but the kind of the utopian or the emancipatory ideal for Attali is production for one's own pleasure, which is prefigured in one of the elements of repetition, which is this atomization in a certain sense. But whereas in repetition, this atomization is at the service of the selling of these products and of what he calls bureaucracy. And I think he's wrong about that. But therefore, what he means is a certain form of control, which is exerted through the dissemination of these products. Whereas in composition, you have this suspension of these this objective of, you know, making a profit or even communicating with others, which is weird. Like it's a very weird idea, and I'm not sure Attali ever heard of, probably not ever heard of Henry Flint, but Henry Flint had a kind of similar idea in the 60s of replacing art making with what he called brand, which was basically your just likings. You didn't get to produce art, which is a socially determined kind of activity. You just did what you already liked for the sake of what you liked. I'm against the idea, but anyway, it's a kind of a radical kind of idea, and Attali is trying to kind of construct like a form of sociality in a certain sense out of what is a basically atomized relationship to art, to one's own likings in a certain sense, right? Which some would make the case that is a form of libertarianism or kind of anarcho-capitalism or whatever, something that is more prone to that end of the political spectrum than to Gattungswesen or anything that Marx would have envisaged. Therefore, you have like all this criticism of Attali as a conservative economist and things like that. So there's a lot to be discussed on that end, actually, about that. Yeah. Any more comments or questions? I have 10 minutes now. Please don't be shy.
Can I read something? It
Yes,
relates a bit to the sort of disjuncture between like the autonomy of composition and modi. It's from Jameson actually. So let me add that modernism and its accompanying aesthetics, mostly organized around defenses of the so-called autonomy of art, paradoxically offer the strongest avenue for the integration of art in a socialist society. For all such apologies insist on the function of art as negation, and it is around the negation of every actually existing society and its practices that the vocation of art needs to be organized and defended. Like the ombudsman in the arena of power, the existence of art is to be justified by the necessity of its negative and critical function, which ranges from outright social content to the very practices of sense perception itself, as in abstract art, and the conduct of daily life. So, it doesn't, I don't think it resolves the issue, but it might, I think something about maybe this is the linkage, that the autonomy of composition in its opposition to sort of its cultural surround offers a kind of linkage to modi, or its association.
Yeah, but yeah, this is valid for modernism, if I understand correctly, right? Of course, it's a specific kind of also social phase of art making. And one can read also a lot of Adornian kind of echoes there, like in the sense that, of course, the autonomy of art entails a negation of its surroundings, because by this autonomy itself, what the work of art is kind of withdrawing from the integration, the direct integration in the social whole, in the sense that it is something that is detached from the social whole. And of course, Attali is interesting in that sense, because he also deals with the means by which you get to have a detached fruition of what counts as an autonomous work of art. But at the same time, the autonomous work of art is elaborating on historically sedimented materials, right? So in a certain sense, there is an inevitable social dimension of the autonomous work of art, at the same time that there is this detachment that comes from the fact that he's supposed to be recognized and and enjoyed in by its own terms, in a certain sense, right? And this is the criticality of the work of art, in a certain sense, in this kind of Adornian framework. So I recognize a lot of that in what James is saying, but it seems to me that this is still a form of resistance that is first is a form of resistance that comes from the face of representation, because you have to have the elements of representation in the Attali sense in order to have like this autonomous work of art, against repetition in a certain sense. Like repetition is the enemy when you talk about modernism and the autonomous work of art, because in repetition you tend to dissolve the autonomy of the work of art by the standardization and the very fact that you have replicas of things circulating in the social world. So in a certain sense, I'm at pains of seeing this as a direct relationship to what Attali is calling composition. So I think it falls short of that still, anyway. But yeah, maybe there's a vector to be pursued there. Ricardo.
Hello to all. Just a conjecture. Don't you think that the way of the atomistic way of producing and circulating and experiencing music is what has happened with the pandemic?
Sorry, can you speak? I think it's a bit soft. I didn't hear you. Well.
Okay.
Okay.
Just a conjecture. Don't you think that the way of composing and the way of circulation of music during pandemic was exactly the atomistic way of experiencing music?
Yeah, in a certain, yeah, that's interesting. But
through that.
Sorry.
Through that specific infrastructure and neoliberalistic mode of production.
Yeah, I think it's a good conjecture, but at the same time, it seems unclear. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm not saying there's no novelty, okay? But it's unclear what is the novelty par rapport. I mean, regarding what was actually the dominant mode of musical fruition before the pandemic. Of course, it intensified the fact that if before, like, there's a tendency of enjoying things by oneself, there's this atomization of the consumption, and I think it's even more dramatic in the realm of film, right? For instance, in Netflix and these kind of things, usually people still went to the theater to watch a movie, right? So when you get like Netflix and this kind of thing, people are not going to the movie anymore, to the movie theater, but they are experiencing stuff in their homes and stuff like that. Of course, the pandemic kind of offered an opportunity perhaps for enforcing that model of consumption. But yeah, for me, still unclear if the pandemic produced novel forms of consumption instead of intensifying the ones that were the tendencies that were in a sense already there in a certain sense.
Yeah, but maybe something latent.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, but that's a good point. Thank you. So we're at the end.
If this is a good place to stop. Maybe thank you so much for the talk and looking forward to next week. Maybe we should stop the recording and discuss presentations and how you want to conduct that.
Okay, we can do that.
All right, great. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, everybody.